This is part 2 of the story of Mintauts Blosfeld, a Latvian SS Legionnaire caught in a nightmare of retreat and resistance. As the Soviet forces closed in, he and his comrades were thrown into brutal holding battles, forced to fight against all odds to delay the inevitable. It was no longer about winning, it was about surviving. Through mud, fire, and exhaustion, this is the continuation of a forgotten soldier's journey, a harrowing look into the collapse of the Eastern Front and the men who refused to break. After my time recovering from wounds, I was sent to Jelgava. That was where the Legion's assembly unit was located, the place where all soldiers returning from hospital were gathered, evaluated, and reassigned based on their condition. I spent a couple of days there, surrounded by other men like myself, some still limping, some with bandaged heads or arms in slings, before I was ordered to move on with a group of Legionnaires, roughly company strength, to a place I had only heard about before, Runale Castle. We arrived late in the evening. The sky was already darkening when we were marched inside the vast stone palace. They told us we would be sleeping on the floor of the downstairs corridors. The upper floors, they said, were off limits. They still held a trace of their former beauty. Chandeliers, silk wallpaper, ornate furniture. We did not belong up there. Our world was now one of rifles, boots, and mud. The next morning, training began, and it was brutal. The officers drove us hard, physical exercise from dawn until dusk, marches, drills, obstacle courses. I suppose they believed we had gone soft during our hospital time, as if rest and recovery had made us forget how to obey. To remind us of our place, they enforced harsh discipline. Any sign of sloppiness or poor attitude was punished in absurd and humiliating ways. Some of us were forced to wade across the castle pond, water up to our chests, then climb the fountain in the centre like clowns on display. Still dripping wet, we were ordered back into formation. We carried out landing drills as well, on the coastal meadows near the river Lilup. Rubber boats were launched, and we were tasked with assaulting the opposite bank. Real ammunition was used. It was no game. Some of the defenders on the far side opened fire too early, or perhaps with too much eagerness. A few of our men were hit, wounded or worse, before their boots even touched land. It reminded us that war, even in training, left little room for mistakes. As midsummer approached, the mood shifted. We were preparing to celebrate St. John's Night, Jani, our most cherished Latvian holiday. Despite the looming war, we gathered meat, bread, wine, and even hired musicians to play for the occasion. The only thing missing were the fires, which tradition demanded we light in the fields. But with Russian aircraft recently spotted over Lithuania, the officers had forbidden any light. Still, no one seemed to care. As night fell, the band assembled on the castle balcony and began to play. The music echoed through the courtyard. Girls from nearby villages arrived, carrying wreaths of flowers they had woven by hand. They placed them on our heads, smiling softly. We danced around the fountain, sang old songs, and laughed like boys. For a brief moment, we were no longer soldiers. We were just Latvians, celebrating the summer night. I watched it all from inside. The night before, I had been appointed duty NCO and was ordered to remain in the castle to guard the company's quarters. I paced the dark halls alone, hearing the music faintly in the distance, knowing my comrades were dancing with girls under the stars while I kept watch among empty coats and stacked rifles. I didn't mind, not really. I had the sense the joy outside would not last long. A week later, our orders came. We were going back to the front. Only the sick or unfit remained behind. The rest of us packed our gear and boarded a narrow-gauge train. The mood was somber. The train took us to Mintauts, where we transferred to a larger one. That train would carry us all the way east. We departed late at night. Some men slept. Others sat around a candle in the corner of the wagon, playing cards and laughing quietly. The rain began to fall and was still falling when we rolled into Jelgava a few hours later. We stopped there briefly before continuing our journey. By the time we woke, Jelgava was far behind us. When I opened the wagon door, all I could see was forest and swamp stretching out into the grey morning. We were not heading for Riga, as some had hoped. We were bound for Krustpils, a far less comforting destination. After a short stop there, we pressed on. It was hot that day. Some of us climbed onto the roof of the train to escape the stifling air inside the wagon. We wore nothing but our swimming trunks and lay on the wooden surface as if we were on a beach. For hours the sun beat down on us. From time to time we had to lie flat against the roof to avoid being swept off by low bridges or power cables. It was foolish, but staying inside was unbearable. When the sun began to set, the air turned cold, and we were glad to climb down when the train finally stopped in Varaklani. That evening we reached Rejoining and slept there. The next morning we bathed in the river. The water was clear and cool, the bottom soft with sand. Afterwards, we were each given a bowl of soup from the field kitchen. It was not much, but it warmed our bellies. That night, we crossed the border into Russia. We saw watchtowers now, each one manned by railway guards. Alongside the tracks, burned-out locomotives and mangled wagons lay in ditches, grim reminders of partisan attacks. Charred metal and blackened wheels marked where others had been less lucky. The next afternoon, while waiting at a station, we were suddenly ordered to take cover. The anti-aircraft guns aboard the train had already begun to fire. Russian planes screamed down from the sun. We hadn't seen them. Neither had the sentries. Explosions ripped the ground around us. We dove into shallow roadside ditches. There was nowhere else to go. Machine gun fire swept the tracks. Cannon rounds burst in the fields nearby. Then the planes circled back for another attack. But this time, our gunners were ready. They opened up with everything they had, and the sky lit with tracer fire. The Russians veered off and vanished to the east. We had not escaped unscathed. A man from the next wagon was dead, hit before he ever reached the battlefield. A barn near the station was ablaze. Worse, one of the ammunition wagons had caught fire. We watched helplessly as it burned, the shells inside cooking off and exploding one by one. No one could approach. We waited in silence until the flames consumed everything. By nightfall, we reached Opochka and began the next part of the journey on foot. I had reunited with Corporal Andamanis, an old friend from our days in the Guards Company. That night, we were sent ahead of the main column to scout the road and guard against partisans. It was a quiet summer night. The sky was clear, the moon high. We walked with the caution of hunters, checking every bush, every tree. Somewhere to our left, a bridge crossed the river. Ahead of us, flares glowed faintly, and the low thunder of artillery echoed across the hills. We searched every ditch, knowing the partisans preferred to strike from the shadows. Our rifles were ready, our eyes strained into the dark. Behind us, the rest of the patrol followed in single file. Further back, the main column moved quietly along both sides of the road. We took only a few short breaks that night. By morning, we reached the bridge, crossed the river, and moved into a small forest. We were told to rest there during the day. I lay down in the cool grass, the river murmuring nearby. But peace never lasts long. That afternoon, Russian aircraft attacked the bridge. The roar of engines returned, followed by the sharp bursts of cannon fire. We didn't go to see the damage, but the shouting from the direction of the bridge told us enough. It had been hit. After dark, we resumed the march. The road was newly built, made from wooden blocks laid by the Germans to serve the front line. Trucks passed us in the dark, their shapes barely visible through the dust they kicked up. In the distance, we saw another air raid. Red tracer rounds climbed into the night sky. Later, as we passed the area that had been bombed, we saw the craters on both sides of the road. Smoke still hung in the air like morning mist. This time, the Russians had missed. By sunrise, we reached another river, the Alolja. Its small bridge was already wired for demolition. 2 German soldiers stood guard over a pair of aerial bombs placed at its base. We slept nearby, hidden in the lakeside bushes, until night came again. By morning, we reached Krasnoye. There, we were split by unit and sent to our respective regimental headquarters. My friend Andamanis was placed in charge of our group, and together we moved to the headquarters of the 32nd Regiment, based in the village of Lavi. The bunkers were solid, deep, hidden beneath the trees, well camouflaged. We stood in line beneath the shade as the new regimental commander, a man named Apparats, inspected us. We had heard rumours that the former commander, Kripens, had been dismissed for incompetence during the St. John's Day battle. Whether true or not, we were glad to see Apparats. He looked like a man who knew what he was doing. On the way to the front-line trenches, our guide pointed out a hill. St. John's Hill, he said. Many men died there. We nodded in silence. The ground around it still bore the scars, trenches, craters, and the mutilated trunks of birch trees. As we neared the front, we saw a sign posted at the roadside, written in Latvian, "Artillery fire zone. Helmets must be worn from here." We entered a forest where communication trenches crisscrossed through the birch trees. The trees were torn and splintered by shellfire. Mortar craters dotted the ground. We passed through in silence. When we reached the company headquarters, I recognized no one. The commander was a stranger, and so were the men. At first, he considered dividing us among the existing platoons, but in the end, he kept us together under his direct command for special assignments. Corporal Andamanes was made head of the company headquarters. I was placed as the number 1 on the machine gun. Our bunker was positioned nearby, close enough to the commander's, with a short trench connecting the two. It was well built, and over the door the previous occupants had scratched a name into the wood. The Parish Council House of Purmale. At night, we posted a sentry with the machine gun near the entrance. The rest of us slept inside, rifles within reach. The machine gun nest itself was strong, with clear fields of fire in every direction. I could feel its weight as I cleaned it each morning, cold, heavy, dependable. For the first few days, the front was quiet. We visited old comrades, swapped stories from the hospital, and listened to theirs from the line. But each name we asked about brought a new wound, missing, killed, or wounded. There were few left now. War had done its work. One day, we walked to the far left flank of our company's position, hoping to find a friend from the guards company. The forest ended, and to reach the strong point we had to jump into a trench and cross an open field. The position sat atop a small hill. From there, we could see everything, the narrow gap of land between 2 lakes, the Russian rear, the enemy trenches, and even those of our neighbouring regiment. But we were warned. Observe only at night. The Russians had fixed an anti-tank gun on this position. They had the range dialed in exactly. Any movement during daylight was met with a burst of fire. So we stayed low. We watched. We waited. The war had not changed, but we had. On the morning of the 9th of July, a rumour began to circulate among us, whispered first by one of the runners, then passed quietly from man to man. It was not yet official, but it had the weight of truth behind it. We were likely to withdraw from our current frontline positions the following day. I did not question it. The signs were there. Command had grown tense, movements more deliberate, and if it was true, then I needed to be ready for anything. I cleaned my machine gun meticulously, removing every trace of grit and old oil, wiping the receiver clean, feeding the mechanism with a fresh layer of grease. Then I made my way to the trenches that skirted the edge of the forest and aimed the barrel towards the Russian lines, which I could just make out across the open land, no more than 400 yards distant. My friend, the corporal, stood beside me, his binoculars raised to his face. When I opened fire, the weapon spat out the entire belt in one roaring stream, the tracer streaking low across the field. The corporal watched closely and nodded in approval. The gun performed flawlessly. I felt the familiar recoil vibrate through my arms, the warmth of control and confidence returning to me. As soon as the last round was fired, we scrambled into a nearby bunker, taking the advice of the veterans who had posted there. Within moments, mortar bombs began crashing down around our position. We could feel the earth tremble beneath us. One of the entrance posts was completely shattered by a direct hit. The timing had been razor thin. Later that afternoon, I sat and refilled my belt, pressing each round into place with cold, steady fingers. The sun fell behind the horizon and a blood-red dusk swallowed the sky. Off in the distance to the west, we saw villages ablaze. The flames danced against the darkening sky, warning us that the Russians knew we were pulling back. It did not bode well. Such fires were like flares in the night, telling the enemy that movement was underway. We doubted the Soviets would let us slip away quietly. The stillness of the night was deceptive. Through the calm, we could hear the grumble of engines from the other side. Sometimes voices carried too, shouts, laughter, even song, the kind of careless noise that only men preparing for something feel bold enough to make. The Russians were getting ready as well. That same night, a detachment of our own crept silently through the front line and disappeared into no man's land. They were a mine-laying team, assigned to leave behind a surprise for any enemy patrols that tried to follow us without caution. Their movement was like ghosts, soundless and dark. Only a few shots were heard through the night. The occasional rifle crack, a mortar thudded somewhere far off. We had set up the machine gun near the mouth of our bunker and had just begun to lie down for a few hours' rest when a runner arrived. His breath heavy from the sprint, his words urgent. We were summoned to company headquarters immediately. At the command post, our officer gave us a swift order. Reports had come in of a potential Russian breakthrough in the neighbouring battalion sector. Our squad was to head there and confirm what had happened. It was not clear yet how serious the breach was, or if it had even occurred at all. We moved quickly and quietly, coming up behind the front-line trenches of the neighbouring company. Their commander greeted us, but could offer little more than guesswork. The details were murky. One of his men led us deeper toward the forward positions, serving as our guide. We approached cautiously, every sense alert. As we neared the trench in question, we heard voices, Latvian voices, friendly. The enemy had withdrawn. Apparently, a small group of Russians had managed to cross into our lines unnoticed. They had come silently, shadows in the dark. The sentry only saw them as they leapt over the trench. He opened fire, and the Soviets disappeared into the brush behind us. That was all anyone knew. Where they had gone or what they planned remained uncertain. They were no longer in the immediate area, but no one could say whether they were regrouping nearby or already miles away. Given the tension of the situation, we stayed with the neighbouring company for the remainder of the night. We kept watch in total silence, eyes locked on the tree line, ears straining for any sign of movement. At first light, we scanned the terrain properly. Ahead of us, a clearing stretched between our position and the Russian lines. In the centre of that clearing stood a lone log cabin. To test whether it housed anyone, we trained our machine guns on it and unleashed a burst. The bullets punched straight through, the wooden planks splintering with each hit. Nothing moved inside, not a sound. We were confident the cabin was empty. If anyone had been inside, they would have been torn to pieces. The sun climbed higher, bathing the forest in gold. Everything was quiet again. We had survived another night. We packed up our gear, left the neighbouring trenches behind, and returned to our own unit. There was no fanfare, no speeches, just the heavy knowledge that soon we would be on the move, and whatever waited for us next would be worse. The Russians knew now that something was shifting, and the worst was surely yet to come. After we reported back to the company commander, he gave the order for us to return to our bunker and get some sleep. We were to retreat that evening, and every bit of rest would count. I did not feel particularly tired, so I took out a pencil and began writing a letter home by candlelight. The quietness in the bunker was deceiving, calm like the stillness before a storm. I had just laid down and closed my eyes when suddenly the door burst open with such force that we all jolted upright. A runner stood in the entrance, breathless and wild-eyed, shouting, "Stand to! A Russian attack is imminent." Even before he finished speaking, the distant thunder of artillery answered for him. Explosions rolled through the air, shaking the ground and making us scramble for our weapons. We rushed out of the bunker, fastening our belts, checking ammunition pouches, gripping rifles and machine guns. The shells were not falling directly on us, but just to the north, hammering the trenches of the 33rd Regiment. A few mortar bombs whistled in and burst near our lines, but the brunt of the storm was not yet ours to face. Still, we knew the danger. Our own artillery had already withdrawn in preparation for the evening retreat. If the Russians chose this moment to launch a full assault, we would be exposed, outgunned and alone. The bombardment lasted for what felt like an eternity, perhaps half an hour, and then, as the echoes began to fade, we heard it, the dull, low rumble of enemy infantry moving in. The Russian assault had begun. I could hear the voice of our company commander through the din, yelling into a field telephone or shouting at someone nearby. "Whatever you do, do not let the Russians get through the gap between the lakes. If they get through, everything is lost." I had no idea who he was addressing. Perhaps it was the 33rd Regiment, or perhaps it was the strong point positioned just ahead of our own trench line, whose machine guns commanded that crucial gap. But if it was the latter, it was already too late. A runner came stumbling in from the strong point, and his face told the story before he even opened his mouth. The man was visibly shaking, his voice cracking as he reported that the Russians had broken through the 33rd after a brutal artillery pounding. Their trench lines had collapsed under the weight of the barrage. The strong point was under accurate fire from Russian anti-tank guns, so precise that our men could not raise their heads, let alone operate their machine guns. They were pinned down, wounded and isolated. The runner's nerves were so frayed that as he tried to report, the very pistol hanging from his belt accidentally discharged. The flare did not fire into the sky as intended. Instead, it struck his own boot, and within seconds the flames had scorched his leg. We bandaged the burn as best we could, and the poor man limped away toward the rear, his hands still trembling. Then it was our turn. The Russian shelling began to creep toward our sector, smashing into the birch forest around us. The air filled with the cracking of branches, the thud of shrapnel ripping into tree trunks, and the sharp hiss of splinters slicing past our ears. Earth fountained up with every impact, and the smoke stung our eyes. We braced ourselves. Rifles were checked, machine guns loaded, and hand grenades stacked neatly on the trench walls, ready to be grabbed in a moment's notice. Every man was tense, waiting for the first Russian shadows to emerge from the trees. But the attack never came. Instead, the order arrived. It was time to pull out. The company commander stepped out of his bunker, still holding the telephone receiver in one hand. His face was pale, but calm. We were to form a rear guard and cover the withdrawal of the rest of the company through the lakeside forest. As the men behind us began their retreat, we moved carefully downhill. A small group of Legionnaires passed us, dragging an anti-tank gun across the rough ground. We gave them a nod and pressed on. As we emerged from the forest, we could see the rest of the company stretched out before us, moving in column across open fields under the midday sun. Sweat ran down our backs as we trudged forward with heavy packs and weapons. But then came the crack of gunfire. From the woods to our right, rifles snapped and light machine guns chattered. Tracer rounds sliced the air above our comrades, and for a split second, confusion gripped the column. Then the commander raised his hand and pointed. Without a word, every man in the company turned toward the trees and ran. We sprinted for the cover of the forest. My boots slammed into the dirt. My lungs burned. My hands clutched the machine gun tight against my chest. As soon as I reached the edge of the woods, I dropped to the ground, found a firing position, and let off several bursts into the birches. But the foliage was too thick. I could not make out a clear target, only shadows and movement. After a few short bursts, I ceased fire. No shots came back. Gradually, the rest of the company stopped firing too. Whatever ambush had been waiting for us had either been broken or had pulled back. Our quick and decisive reaction had made them think twice. There was silence again, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the panting of exhausted men. We had survived the crossing, but this retreat was only just beginning, and I knew the Russians were not far behind. The attackers had disappeared, fled most likely after our counterfire. We had no time to sweep the forest or pursue them. The company regrouped quickly in the open field, reassembling into platoons with grim urgency, and we continued the march. The forest on our right thinned out, and the trees gave way to open ground. The company moved downhill into a shallow depression, the pace steady, men watchful, but worn from the long day and heavy fighting. Then, without warning, we were hit. A sudden burst of machine gun fire tore into us from the right. It was close, frighteningly close, and frighteningly accurate. Everything collapsed into chaos in an instant. Screams rose through the gunfire as men were hit. The company commander, just about to raise his hand to give an order, was cut down on the spot. All around me, comrades fell. Some tried to return fire, others just ran. There was almost no cover. The machine guns swept the depression without mercy. The few who survived scattered for whatever protection they could find: ditches, fallen comrades, patches of grass. Our group, still partly shielded by the trees, reached the edge of the forest and came upon a horrific sight. The field before us was scattered with bodies, our comrades, many dead, others wounded and crawling hopelessly toward the rye field that bordered the far side of the hollow. Some of them were still moving, dragging themselves through the wet soil, but Russian fire cut them down before they got far. Then I saw it, the machine gun nest. It sat on a low hill off to our right, no more than a few 100 meters away. Next to it were a group of Russians, shouting and gesturing at our wounded, trying to force them to surrender. They had not yet seen us. I hit the dirt, raised my machine gun, and took careful aim at the Russian gunners. I squeezed the trigger. Nothing. A cold shock ran through me. The bolt was jammed. I tried again, pulling harder, forcing it back with all my strength. Nothing. The top hatch was stuck too. My gun was dead. I looked at the enemy machine gun still rattling away. I had no firepower, just my legs, and so I ran. The others began moving too, darting down into the depression. Bullets whipped through the air, tracers snapped past my ears. I sprinted, but the soft, marshy ground dragged at my boots, and the weight of the useless machine guns slowed me down. Behind me, the corporal caught up. He shouted over the chaos, "Throw it away! Toss the bone saw and get into the rye!" He had already emptied his magazine. The Russians were still firing. I obeyed. I hurled the machine gun into the marsh and ran with the corporal. Together we reached the edge of the rye field and dropped down. We crawled through the stalks, pushing forward on our bellies, the bullets still cracking overhead. At last, we reached the forest line on the far side and disappeared into its safety. There were only a few of us now, a small group, ghosts of what had once been a full company. We paused at the lakeside and lobbed a few grenades into the bushes, hoping to scare off any Russians who might have been following. Then we pushed westward through the trees, shaken, silent, low on weapons, and uncertain of the path ahead. All I had were the grenades tucked into my belt and one in my hand, ready to pull the pin if needed. After some time, we came to a bridge crossing the river Velikaya near what used to be the headquarters of the 32nd Regiment. Our group was now under the command of Corporal Andamanis, the highest-ranking survivor among us. On the far bank, we met two observers crouched in the brush, eyes fixed on the horizon. The command post had already been abandoned. The bunkers were scorched ruins, burned out and left behind. There were no officers. We reported to the observers what had happened to our company, then kept moving, heading toward the rear. We spent the rest of the afternoon on the road. When darkness fell, we finally reached the village of Krasnoye. A long column of troops was already passing through, withdrawing westward. Somewhere in the village, a house was burning. The fire lit up the road in flickering orange, revealing a low stone wall on our left that was being struck by bullets. The enemy was already that close. To avoid being hit, we walked in the ditches alongside the road. The bullets hissed just above our heads. Any vehicle trying to pass through had to race at full speed under the spray of fire. As we reached the far side of the village, an officer stepped into our path. His voice was urgent, almost pleading. He asked if we could scout a patch of trees about 500 meters off to the right of the road. He promised fire support from anti-aircraft guns if needed. They were already lined up nearby, barrels pointed north. But after glancing over us, exhausted, dirty, half-armed, he changed his mind. "No," he said. "Go to the rear, boys. Just try to find weapons along the way. You will need them." We did not argue. Just moments after we resumed our march, artillery shells began crashing into the village behind us. Shouts rang out from the same trees the officer had wanted us to inspect. The Russians were already there. A piece of shrapnel sliced the air in front of us and slammed into the road, kicking up dirt. We ducked and hurried on, pushing ourselves harder. We walked like that for the rest of the night. By sunrise, on the 11th of July, 1944, we neared the village of Panovo. We had heard the supply unit of our company was stationed there. After a short search, we found them. Their reactions said it all. They looked at us as though we had come back from the dead. They had heard the rumors about our company's destruction and were overjoyed to see us alive. Their joy quickly turned to sympathy when we recounted what had happened. Since they had brought supplies for an entire company, and we were all that remained, we were told to take whatever we needed. I was given a rifle, some ammunition, and grenades for my belt. We were also handed 2 bottles of vodka, which the supply men had somehow acquired during the night. Our spirits lifted a little. With weapons in our hands and something warm in our bellies, we felt like soldiers again. But we were not allowed to rest for long. The supply officer had orders. Everyone was to return north along the road to establish a new blocking position. The Russians were still advancing. We were given mugs of steaming coffee, and then we set out. A couple 100 meters past the village, we left the road to rest briefly in the field. We were exhausted and hungry from the night march. We shared 1 bottle, then a second. While we rested, a car approached. It stopped near us. A few officers stepped out. One of them barked something in German, ordering us over. We obeyed. Corporal Andamanis tried to answer the officer's questions, but his German was poor, and the officer quickly lost patience. Then the corporal pointed to me and said, "Interpreter." My time with the guards company had taught me enough German. I clicked my heels, gave the proper salute, and introduced our unit and destination, addressing the officer by his correct rank. I explained that we were remnants of the first company, recently overrun, and that we were on our way to rejoin the front. He nodded, satisfied. "At least you have weapons," he said. "Do not stay here long. Move out." We did. The road took us through open countryside. On the eastern side, low marshy woods. To the west, a lake choked with reeds. The road continued north before turning sharply out of sight. On a rise to the right, we saw Legionnaires already dug in. We were assigned to a new company forming in the field nearby. Our task was to learn how to use a new weapon, the Panzerfaust. It was the first time any of us had seen one. A young lieutenant, fresh from the front, dirty-faced and unshaven, gave the demonstration. He explained the aiming and firing clearly, then launched a couple of the projectiles as examples. The explosions left no doubt. This was serious firepower. It was also clear enemy tanks were on the way. Trucks and carts raced past us to the rear, some of the drivers still drinking, shouting, "The tanks are coming!" Soon after, the road quieted, the dust settled, and then we heard it. The distant roar of engines, the clatter of tracks, gunfire in the distance. Panic spread through some of the men. A few even began to run. Officers pulled their pistols and forced them back into line. The corporal and I each grabbed a Panzerfaust and found a position behind some bushes near the road. We were nervous, but focused. This was the moment we had prepared for. More Legionnaires joined us, spacing out along the hedgerow. We checked our escape route. Nothing but swampy ground behind us. If the tanks broke through, the only option was to vanish into the undergrowth. We waited. Time passed. Then came news. The tanks had been stopped further up the road. We slumped in the grass, relief flooding us. Lit cigarettes trembled in our fingers. That evening, we were ordered to fall back again. We handed the Panzerfausts to the supply men, who loaded them onto wagons. As we marched toward Panovo, we heard explosions behind us. Smoke towered into the sky. The Germans were blowing up the road to block the enemy's advance. We passed a Latvian Legionnaire lying face down in a ditch, dead. At first, we did not know how he had fallen. Only later did we understand. He may have been one of the deserters executed that day. We kept moving. Past the village, the road veered west into a darkening forest. Behind us, more explosions echoed, but as night fell, they ceased. In the quiet, we found a burning stretch of forest. Charred trees surrounded us. Artillery pieces were stuck in the sandy track, and we helped free them before continuing. We pushed through the warm summer night, westward again, toward a new line, a new battle, and whatever came next. The endless forest around us was said to have been set alight by German units to prevent partisans from using the road as cover. The smoke clung low to the earth, filling the air with a choking haze that stretched across the countryside, like a warning of what might await our own homeland if things continued as they were. We were exhausted. Another night had passed with no real rest, just miles of retreat behind us and no certainty of what lay ahead. When the morning sun began to cut through the mist and smoke, we emerged from the woods into open country. It was there that someone spotted something that made our stomachs knot. A distant fire tower, barely visible on the horizon, now flying a red flag. The Russians? Already here? No one could say. Some German soldiers stationed along the road believed it was merely the work of partisans, but we were no longer sure of anything. After marching for another hour under the rising heat, we were finally ordered off the road to rest on a steep embankment. The view to our right stretched over flat, shimmering fields, quiet and golden in the sun. The stillness was almost unnerving, but it lulled a few of the men into sleep where they sat. That peace was shattered when we heard the low drone of approaching aircraft. Everyone froze, squinting toward the sky. 3 planes came in low from the direction of the scorched forest, some behind them, hiding their identity until they were almost overhead. That was when we saw it, the red stars on their wings, Russian reconnaissance. They flew so low we could see the pilots' faces behind the glass, but they did not fire. They circled once, then climbed and vanished eastward. A short time later, orders came. We wouldn't be moving far. We passed through a line of defensive trenches and were shown the stretch of front we were now to hold. The position was surprisingly strong, dug into a series of low hills with good bunkers buried deep under timber-reinforced roofs and camouflaged so well they vanished into the landscape. In front of us, the trees had all been cut down, leaving jagged stumps twisted with barbed wire. It was clear the Germans had invested time preparing this position. They intended to hold here, but with only around 20 men left per company and much of our weaponry lost, we barely had enough strength to cover the sector. While some dug communication trenches between bunkers and machine gun posts, I was sent with a small group of legionnaires to secure the rear. A village about a mile behind us had to be cleared. We moved in cautiously, aware that even such a task could turn into a firefight if partisans were hiding inside. At first, the village seemed empty, doors swinging open, no sign of movement. We swept from house to house, rifles ready, until eventually we found 10 civilians huddled in a back room. They looked terrified. One of our men spoke Russian and ordered them to leave immediately for Opochka. They resisted, claiming they had just fled from the Russians and wanted only a day or 2 of rest. But we didn't have time for sympathy or negotiations. When we raised our weapons and made it clear they had no choice, they gathered their things and began walking across the fields in silence. With the village now ours, we scoured it for anything useful. Some men chased chickens but failed to catch any. Others were luckier, killing a pig they found in the fields and carrying it back triumphantly along with a pot to cook it in. There were cheers as we returned to the trenches. I changed into my swimming trunks to help with the digging, the sun beating down, while others butchered the meat for a proper meal. But the work didn't last. Just after 3 in the afternoon, shells exploded in no man's land, fountains of dirt rising into the sky. We thought it was our own artillery, maybe adjusting range, until one hit close to our trench. Russian fire. Another plane appeared above us, and as we scrambled into uniform and loaded our rifles, it swooped low, firing on the bunkers. Above ground again, we could hear fighting to our left, shouting, automatic weapons, the grinding of tank tracks. Legionnaires were retreating from a village about a mile north of us, chased by a Soviet tank that sped toward our rear. The firing intensified. Then the real danger became clear. We were about to be attacked from both the front and the rear. Our numbers were too few to hold, and with no contact from regiment or division, our commander finally made the only decision he could. We abandoned the trenches and ran across dead ground toward another village behind our lines, bullets already cracking through the air. We passed a small lake along the way, and drank greedily, soaked in sweat and heat. Reaching the village, perched on a low hill, we turned and saw them, the long line of Russians following us across the open fields. But now for once we had the advantage. The enemy was exposed in the sunlight while we fired from the shade behind a wooden fence. It felt like a rifle range. We shouted to one another, called out targets, and watched man after man fall. The rest dropped into ditches and returned fire, but they were shooting into the sun. They couldn't see us, and so, for a brief moment, we had the upper hand again. The trees of the village cast long shadows across the fields, but our thoughts were elsewhere. We were tense, especially about our exposed left flank where the enemy had been making steady gains. But then, suddenly, the sharp, familiar burst of German machine guns cracked through the air from that direction. Relief swept over us. We weren't alone. Someone was still holding the line. Then came another sound. Rifle fire, and machine guns again, this time from behind us. Our hearts sank. If the Russians had flanked us, we were finished. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed 2 of my comrades and we crept cautiously toward the rear of the village to find out what was happening. We moved low and silent, taking cover behind the last row of houses. From there we could see the truth, fucking it wasn't the enemy. A full company of Legionnaires was advancing toward us in a broad line across the fields. They were ours, but they didn't know we were still here. Their machine guns were raking our village. They thought the Russians had already taken it. The situation was beyond dangerous. We couldn't show ourselves. Bullets were striking the walls of the houses with frightening consistency. One wrong move and our own men would tear us to pieces. Someone nearby tied a white handkerchief to his bayonet and waved it carefully around the corner. I did the same with my steel helmet. The shooting stopped. We stepped into view, waving our arms and shouting. It worked, just in time. The company was only 100 yards away, rifles raised, ready to storm the village. If we had waited even a few seconds longer, they would have charged. We were surrounded by questions the moment they reached us. 2 officers arrived, and I quickly reported the situation to one of them. Then we all pushed back into the village, where the fresh troops joined our firing line. But when I returned, I noticed my friend, the corporal, was gone. Someone told me he'd been hit and carried to the village centre. I searched the houses until I found him. He was lying in a corner room, pale and trembling. A bullet had gone clean through his left side. His face was grey with blood loss and pain. He kept muttering, "Don't leave me to the Russians." I knelt beside him and promised I'd get him out. I ran back to the line and called over 3 men. We made a makeshift stretcher using rifles and ground sheets and carefully lifted the corporal onto it. He was heavy, a tall, broad-shouldered man. We began our slow walk to the next village, where the temporary divisional headquarters of the Latvian Legion had been set up. It was barely half a mile away, but the weight of him, the heat and our exhaustion made every step an ordeal. We had to stop often, sweat pouring from our faces, our arms and legs aching. But we didn't stop for long. We couldn't. When we finally reached the village, we found a doctor but no proper transport for the wounded. High-ranking officers stood in small groups, scanning the distance with binoculars and asking us what we'd seen. Anti-tank guns were well hidden in the orchards and brush, pointing toward the enemy's likely approach. When we lifted the corporal from the stretcher, blood had pooled beneath him in the ground sheet. It was a grim sight. I sent the other men back to the front line and stayed with him myself, hoping I could find a way to get him out. Half an hour passed before an ammunition wagon appeared, heading toward the rear. We flagged it down and placed him carefully inside. I rode with him. A few miles later, we reached a casualty collection point. That's where we parted. He looked at me, didn't say a word, just reached out and gripped my hand. His pain was obvious. His skin was pale and clammy. I hoped he'd make it. I walked back alone to divisional headquarters. Night had fallen. The roadside battery had taken up position and was firing steadily into the distance. The smoke from the guns hung heavy in the bushes, not drifting but clinging low like morning fog. Anti-aircraft guns were letting loose, their tracer fire cutting sharp red lines through the night sky, reaching for Russian aircraft somewhere out there. Despite all of this, or maybe because of it, I couldn't bring myself to return to the front line. I hadn't slept properly in 3 days. I was drained, my legs weak. I needed a break. I remembered the supply unit of our company was stationed a few miles back and decided to go there. The road was pitch black, but I followed it, my rifle slung and my mind heavy. The commander of the supply unit had known me back in our guards company days. When I arrived, he welcomed me warmly. "You look like hell," he said, then told me I could be useful. Russian planes had strafed and bombed the wagons earlier, and they'd be moving out the next day. He needed drivers. One had been wounded. I could take his place. At first, I hesitated. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to rest, to disappear into the rear and breathe. But another part of me knew my place was with the others, in the line. He made the decision for me. "Don't be stupid," he said. "You need a break. This is it." In the end, I agreed to stay the night and think it over in the morning. We ate a bit, tended to the horses, then climbed into the wagons to sleep, wrapping ourselves in horse blankets. Things had quieted down, though Russian aircraft passed overhead now and then. They dropped flares farther down the road, but spared us. I was thankful. By the time I woke the next morning, 13th July, the sound of battle had returned. Gunfire crackled nearby, and the thump of mortars shook the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the awful roar of the Stalin organ rose, those cursed Russian rocket launchers. The explosions came in bursts, like a drum beat echoing through the woods. The sun was already high and hot, sweat clung to our skin, and the air was thick and hard to breathe. Still, we were shielded somewhat by the forest's edge. Someone suggested we send out a patrol to make sure partisans weren't creeping in behind us. A long line of legionnaires moved into the woods, rifles at the ready. As they vanished between the trees, the shelling didn't stop. In fact, it grew worse. The village behind us caught fire. Flames leapt from roof to roof, and within minutes the whole place was engulfed. Smoke filled the air. The heat and confusion were unbearable. Then the order came. Move out immediately, get to the bridge and cross the river, then make for Opochka. Our wagons were already packed. Horses were harnessed. Without wasting a second, we rolled out. As we passed the burning village, a platoon of legionnaires was moving the other way, straight toward the fight. Leading them was the commander of the 32nd Latvian Regiment, Apparats. His sleeves were rolled, his greying head bare, a machine pistol slung in his hands. "Let's go, lads," he shouted. "Let's show the Ivans what we Latvians are made of." His men followed without hesitation, disappearing into the wall of smoke behind us. We went the opposite way, toward the river and what we hoped would be safety. The land became more open and hilly as we neared the river. Just before the bridge, the road curved and was jammed with military vehicles. Shells were exploding nearby, and the bridge itself was shrouded in smoke. No one dared cross it yet. Then, like a miracle, a thunderstorm rolled in. Rain fell in sheets, drenching us in seconds. But no one cared. The Russians couldn't see us through the downpour, and their shelling went wild. It was our only chance. When it was our turn, we drove the horses hard and ran alongside the wagons. The river below surged with the rain, swollen and angry, but the bridge held. We made it across. Just as we reached the other side, a shell exploded to our right, showering us with dirt and smoke. The horses panicked but pulled hard, dragging the wagons up the incline. We reached the road to Opochka as the rain began to lift. We marched another hour before stopping to rest, drying ourselves in the weak sun and feeding the horses. That evening, as darkness crept in, we moved again. Opochka came into view, the town burning on the horizon. Artillery batteries were set up on the southern edge, firing into the dark. The flashes terrified the horses. Behind us, we could still see the dull flicker of frontline flares. When I rejoined our company's supply unit, only 2 wagons remained of the dozen we had left with. The men, weary from the long night drive, rested in the undergrowth around us, waiting for orders. The evening air was warm as we set off southward once more. Our wagons creaked beneath the weight of whatever supplies remained: rations, ammunition, a few spare uniforms, tools we deemed too valuable to abandon. The drivers walked beside their carts, leading the horses by the halters. One horse trailed behind, tied by a rope. He had been wounded in the air raid and was limping badly. Everyone knew he needed a proper rest, but there was no time. By the time we reached Stiglova, the moon had climbed high. We paused outside a small church, waiting for our turn to continue on the narrow road. While we rested, something strange caught my eye. A single light in the sky, like a faint star drifting across the horizon toward us from the south. It moved steadily, but with an odd, wavering course. It made no sound in the still night. It could not have been an aircraft. No navigation lights flew over us in wartime. Whatever it was, it vanished from sight before anyone could make sense of it. As dawn broke, we crossed the Rejoining highway at Berzgal and pressed on through Ragauka, then Dricini, before finally turning north. We expected to skirt the northern end of Lake Lubanz, but instead we veered south through Bikava, looping around the lake's southern shores, and finally heading west toward Varaklani. By then, 2 days of near-continuous travel had taken their toll. The injured horse was still with us, but he'd only grown weaker. He limped and stumbled, his breathing short. We sold him to a farmer near Varaklani. 2 bottles of vodka exchanged for his life. Most of our journey took us along quiet country lanes. The main highways were crowded with columns of Latgalian farmers, their carts piled high with belongings, fleeing before the Red Army's relentless advance. Those who remained in their villages were either staunch communists or simply too old to flee. On the open roads, Russian aircraft hunted these refugees, strafing wagons and horses with machine gun fire and bombs. On the back roads, we were relatively safe, though we never stopped hearing the distant rumble of guns to the east, where German units fought desperately to halt the Soviets' push into Latvia. From Varaklani, we turned onto the road to Madona, but before reaching the town, we veered north toward Lake Lubanz. There, in a stand of trees west of the lake's marshy edge, we camped for a full day. We slept under the wagons, wrapped in horse blankets. Our company's stores provided us ample food and drink, better than anything we'd tasted in weeks. The lake's waters and the surrounding swamps formed a natural barrier against any Russian advance. Behind us lay the Ivieksta River, another line of defense. After that rest, we resumed our trek deeper into Vidzeme, central Latvia. We passed through dense forest that skirted an impassable swamp, its edges thick with reeds and bog. In places, partisans had tied explosive charges to tree trunks, ready to fell them if the enemy tried to pass. Graves dotted the roadside, simple wooden crosses topped with German helmets, reminders of those who had fallen. For the next few days, we wound our way through Vidzeme. No one knew exactly where we were headed until, at the end of July, an order came. Only 1 man per wagon would remain with the supply unit. The rest of us were to assemble by the roadside. There we were formed into platoons and began marching south on foot. We pressed through Lobert and by afternoon reached Koknis. There, 50 names were read aloud, those legionnaires to be separated from our regiment and reassigned. The rest of us stood by, soaked in sweat and dust, until our names were called. With rifles slung and packs adjusted, we filed into waiting German army transport. The 3-hour ride took us to the divisional headquarters, about 20 miles from Riga, where we would spend the night. At roll call that evening, the officer read a list of men to receive the Iron Cross the following morning. My name was one of them. I'd known nothing of it. The award stunned me. I realized it was for my attempt to knock out that Russian machine gun on 10th July, even though I had failed. At least I had tried. We slept in a barn stacked with hay, and by dawn we were roused for the ceremony. After a quick breakfast, the division's officers assembled us in a clearing. The divisional commander inspected our ranks, then instructed those to be decorated to step forward. About 20 men advanced. One by one, he pinned the Iron Cross to our tunics, shook our hands, and congratulated us. We stood taller, proud, if only for a moment. There was no lingering at headquarters. We boarded our trucks and headed for Riga. As we rolled into town, people lined the streets, cheering us like returning heroes. They believed we came straight from the front, sent to defend the capital after Riga's near encirclement. The Russians had seized Jelgava by surprise only days before and driven tanks all the way to the sea west of Riga, cutting Latvia in two. The residents, fearful for their city, welcomed us with open arms. Cigarette packs rained down into our trucks. Girls pressed flowers onto our uniforms. We wore our iron crosses over our hearts for 24 hours as custom dictated, and that only earned us greater adulation. Our victorious procession ended at the delousing centre, where we exchanged dusty uniforms for sanitized ones. Clean and refreshed, we ended the day at the artillery barracks. A new unit had formed, Battle Group Jekyll, made up of the best men from both Latvian divisions. We would remain in Riga under General Jekyll, taking on special assignments as needed. That evening, after formalities, we were issued Panzer Grenadier uniforms, top-quality weapons, and new equipment, Czech-made Bren guns, pistols, grenade attachments for our rifles. Officers drilled us daily in how to board and dismount quickly from trucks, how to deploy for ambush or defense in seconds. We trained every day in the forests outside Riga. On the morning of the 11th of August, we left the artillery barracks for routine training, but were ordered back by 10 a.m. "Fall in and prepare to move," the new command said. After a hurried meal and weapons issue, we boarded trucks and rolled out of Riga at midday, heading north. The drive took all afternoon, depositing us near the Estonian border by dusk. Darkness fell, and with it, General Jekyll himself descended in a Fiesler Storch. He stood before us, grey hair unkempt, and told us our mission. The Red Army had broken through north of Latvia, pushing toward the sea across Estonia. Our job was to slow them, to delay any armoured thrust until larger German forces could be positioned. With that, a German military police company and an anti-tank gun unit arrived from Riga, completing Battle Group Jekyll. We took what rations remained for the next day, then climbed back into our trucks and headed north through the night. Before long, the rumble of engines faded, replaced by the strobing light of anti-aircraft fire. Russian planes roared overhead, dropping bombs that struck the road ahead of us. We halted, dismounted, and took cover in the bushes until the planes passed. When we dared move again, we passed burning supply trucks and ruined houses, remembering how close we had come. By dawn on the 12th of August, we found ourselves in Estonia's highlands. The countryside was beautiful in the clear morning air, but thick fog soon rolled in, hiding us from sight. By our lunchtime halt, we reached the coordinates given to us, an unmarked fog-shrouded clearing. Everything was eerily still. We could not see far. Orders came to take defensive positions immediately. The platoon commander, who spoke some Estonian, learned from locals that the Red Army was close. The inhabitants loaded carts with their belongings, tears in their eyes. They had no intention of living under Soviet rule. We split into 3 squads and took cover in dense bushes about 400 yards apart, forming a line to watch for the enemy. In the afternoon, we tested the rifle grenades. They didn't fit the launchers properly, so I scraped some plastic away so they would seat correctly. We prepared for a holding action. If tanks appeared, we'd ambush them, then fall back into a second line farther to the rear. By midday, our orders changed. The Soviet tanks had veered east, and we were to reposition. We boarded the trucks again, and in another half hour, we arrived at the new location. As we dismounted, the fog was lifting. We could hear the crash of artillery not far off and the low whine of engines, but no Russian armour was yet in sight, only the promise of it. The German military police were positioned on the left flank, we Latvians held the centre, and the anti-tank gun crews had taken up position on the right. Their guns were hauled up to the crest of the hill without delay, and almost immediately they began firing. As we reached the top and gazed down into the land beyond, it became painfully clear why the gunners had been so quick to act. Stretching out before us was a sea of Red Army vehicles. The rolling landscape was thick with enemy tanks and trucks, caught completely off guard by our sudden arrival. Then came the familiar scream of Stuka dive bombers overhead. The ground seemed to shake as they descended in a coordinated attack, spitting cannon fire and dropping their deadly bombs onto the Soviet armour below. Machine guns chattered from their bellies, mowing down Russian infantry scrambling for cover. It was chaos, and for a brief moment we held the advantage. Our own anti-tank guns joined the attack and the noise was deafening, but that advantage did not last. The Stukas could not linger forever. They banked off and disappeared toward the horizon, likely to refuel and rearm. As soon as the skies cleared, the Soviets recovered. Almost immediately, their tanks began to open fire on our positions. One by one, our anti-tank guns were identified and destroyed by pinpoint enemy fire. Up until that moment, we had been little more than spectators. Now, we were the target. The Russian tanks concentrated their firepower on the hills we held. We hadn't had time to dig proper foxholes or establish hardened positions. We were forced to rely on whatever natural cover we could find. Shallow dips in the earth, scattered rocks, fallen logs. It wasn't enough. The tank shells came without warning, exploding around us with a bone-rattling, skull-splitting roar. I remember the shrieking sound they made just before impact, and the way the air itself seemed to collapse in the blast. Men were killed right beside me, torn apart, thrown backward, silent before they hit the ground. Still, when the tanks began to move forward, the German military police on our left unleashed a volley of anti-tank rockets. 2 Soviet machines were hit, burst into flame, and came to a halt less than 100 meters from where we crouched. When their crews tried to escape, we cut them down. Black smoke curled upward into the still summer air. A few more tanks burned behind them, the final gift of the Stuka's earlier strike. The Russians hesitated. Their tanks withdrew slightly, and now they sent their infantry in to test us. Waves of them poured forward, but they were met by our concealed machine guns. We let them get close, too close, before opening fire. They dropped in clusters, some crying out, some silent, all driven forward by their commissars who stood behind them with pistols, ready to shoot any man who fled. Some did run anyway. I saw one Soviet officer firing on his own retreating men, screaming at them with madness in his eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The Soviets must have realized we were only a small unit. They shifted course, bypassing us to the left, leaving behind the wreckage of men and machines. Only then did I realize I'd been hit. A shard of metal, maybe from a tank shell or a near explosion, had punched through my left cheek. It had shattered half a tooth and torn up my tongue. During the firefight I'd felt nothing, too distracted by survival. But now, the pain bloomed. My whole face throbbed. My eye was nearly swollen shut. The medic came over, examined the wound, wrapped it up, and tied a wounded tag to my tunic. I was sent to the rear while the others began to pull back. Our transport had already arrived, but I had to make the walk alone, crossing open fields under the threat of Russian fire. As I walked through the tall corn, I could actually see the bullets slicing through the stalks, straight lines of destruction. Russian rocket launchers barked in the distance, sending barrages of fire into the retreating troops. I kept my head low, each step a prayer. Eventually, after what felt like miles but was perhaps only one, I reached a field dressing station in an Estonian village. But even here we weren't safe. Russian tanks had pushed through nearby woods and began firing into the village. I saw German officers, some high-ranking, diving into ditches, faces pale, ducking the shrapnel and machine gun fire. For a second, it was almost absurd, watching them dive into cover like schoolboys caught in a storm. But the danger was real, and I dove in after them. A few houses caught fire. The tanks soon pulled back. We got lucky. A unit of Russian SS volunteers passed through shortly after, heading to reinforce the front line. They were technically on our side, and yet we didn't trust them. No one said it aloud, but we watched them closely. Later, I would hear rumors that some of them had turned on their officers, executed them, and defected to the Soviets. If that was true, our suspicion had been well-founded. By evening, transport finally arrived, and I was on my way back to Latvia. We passed long columns of German tanks and troops, units from the Viking division and others, all being thrown into the line to stop the Soviet flood. I was dropped off at Smiltene, where I rested for a couple of days in a crowded military hospital. Then came the orders. No one knew where my unit, Battle Group Jekyll, was located, so I was ordered to report to the Riga artillery barracks instead. The night passed in eerie stillness, the cellar cold but secure. As the sky grew light, we pulled our sentries inside. They had been exposed long enough, and from the cellar's narrow windows, we could now see what we needed. Around breakfast time, the first shells began to fall, our own artillery. The rounds crept closer until it felt like they were aimed at us. Then the ruins shook violently as shells exploded overhead. Bricks rained down, dust filled the air, and for a moment I thought we were finished. But by sheer luck, we suffered no casualties. We reasoned that perhaps this mistake might convince the Russians the farmhouse was unoccupied. Maybe it would keep us from being targeted, for now. Later in the day, we could hear the Russians hard at work in the woods. The sounds of hammering, sawing, and shouting carried clearly across the quiet countryside. Through binoculars, we spotted one Red Army soldier digging a trench in the middle of a field. He carefully camouflaged it and strolled back to the forest, unaware we had seen everything. We let him go, not wanting to reveal our position, but made a mental note of the location for later. When night fell, we moved out to the orchard and dug in a concealed machine gun post. Around midnight, our relief arrived, and after briefing them on the enemy's direction, we crept back through the darkness to our own lines and collapsed into the cellar for sleep. The next day, we were told to join the neighbouring company in their sector of the trenches. The front was being pulled back again. Only a few Legionnaires, including us, were to remain behind as rear guard. The night was black and windy, the trenches unfamiliar and haunted by silence. We paced slowly, fired the occasional round, anything to give the illusion of a manned front. I carried the machine gun again, dragging it from one position to another, eyes straining through the dark. As dawn broke, I was near frozen, my eyelids drooping, when a sudden voice pierced the air, Russian, loud and urgent, somewhere just beyond the bushes ahead. Then came the shells, behind us at first, then closer. It was clear now. The Russian forward observer was adjusting fire. Mortars and anti-tank guns joined in. The bombardment shook our trenches as we braced for the coming assault. I helped haul up extra ammunition and grenades, my hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. The shelling ended as suddenly as it had begun, and then we saw them. Enemy infantry emerged, hundreds strong, moving in scattered waves toward us. I opened fire. My first burst landed short, kicking up dirt. I adjusted, and the next burst cut down several men. One tried crawling for cover but never made it. As they came closer, the Russians ran straight into our hidden barbed wire trap, slowing them just long enough for us to unleash hell. Grenades exploded, men screamed, and chaos overtook them. Those still alive turned and ran. We cheered, smoking and laughing as we fired after them, determined not to leave any wounded behind enemy lines. But the fight wasn't over. The observer's voice returned, and so did the shelling. One shell landed close, a shard of steel ripping through my right palm. The pain was dull at first, but my hand went numb. I handed the gun to my number 2 and took his place. I tried bandaging the wound myself, holding the machine gun magazines and feeding them to my comrade during the second attack. This time, we had a surprise of our own. A machine gunner had set up right in no man's land, hidden and waiting. As the Russians advanced, he opened up from close range, tearing through their ranks before they could reach the wire. They broke. We had won again, but my hand was now useless, swelling and bleeding through the bandage. The company commander patched me up and told me to report to the rear and assist the supply unit until the front line stabilized. A friend gave me a captured Russian submachine gun before I left, just in case. I slung it across my chest, cradled it in my good hand, and made a run across open ground as the Russian shells came again. Diving into a crater, I hesitated only briefly before pushing onward into the safety of the woods. Eventually, I reached a road and was picked up by a passing officer in a car. He dropped me off 5 miles later, but the supply unit was gone. I spent the rest of the day looking for them, reaching divisional headquarters by nightfall. No one knew where the unit was. I slept there, and the next morning, still with no word, I decided to seek medical help. The closest aid station was 10 miles away. I set off on foot through woods and quiet fields. At one point, I spotted a deserter sneaking along the edge of the trees. He hadn't seen me, but I kept him in my sights the entire time, ready to shoot if he got too close. I reached the casualty post by afternoon, had my hand cleaned and redressed, and was sent to the station where a Red Cross train was waiting. We arrived at Cesis after dark. Before we could be admitted to hospital, our clothes were deloused and we were made to shower. But I didn't stay long. The Russians were coming. The next day, the hospital was evacuated. There weren't enough vehicles for all of us, so the walking wounded, like me, were forced to continue on foot toward Riga. The road was jammed with troops, vehicles, and refugees. Russian aircraft strafed the columns at will. I walked through the fields instead, avoiding the main road. After 5 miles, we were halted near a village. Buses came and took us to Riga by nightfall. The city was quiet and dark. The civilians stayed indoors. People no longer welcomed us with pride. They feared the Russians now and didn't want to be seen aiding soldiers. We were taken to an abandoned textile mill near Yugla, converted into a medical sorting station. Beds filled the long, empty weaving halls. Army doctors came through, examining every wounded man, sorting us like livestock. Some were sent to hospitals in Germany, others to be patched up and returned to the front. I waited, praying I would not be sent back to die in the trenches. I was tired, aching, and done with the war. I had survived too much already, and now I wanted out.